Cities rise like monuments to human ambition. Steel and glass climb higher each decade, cutting into the horizon and dimming the daylight. What begins as pride in progress often turns into shadows on the street, heat trapped between walls, and lives stacked in concrete boxes. People celebrate the skyline, yet beneath it they struggle with cost, crowding, and loss of air and land. The city eats the sky one floor at a time, reaching upward without pause. This is not only about architecture, it's about how vertical ambition changes the way we live, breathe, and belong. In the desert of Yemen stands a city that looks like it should not exist. Shibam rises from the sand with tall mudbrick towers, some as high as 11 stories. Seen from a distance, it resembles a cluster of modern skyscrapers, yet it was built hundreds of years ago. Travelers called it the Manhattan of the desert. The name fits because Shibam was one of the first cities in the world to embrace vertical living. People here built upward, not outward, to protect themselves from raiders and floods. Instead of spreading across the valley floor, they stacked their homes one on top of another, creating narrow streets shaded by high walls of clay. Life in Shibam was shaped by necessity. The desert offered little farmland and few safe places to settle. By crowding their homes together and raising them high, residents could keep valuable space for crops and water systems on the ground. The walls, made of sun-dried mudbrick, were thick and insulating, helping to keep interiors cooler during the day and warmer at night. Windows were small and placed carefully to let in air without exposing the inside to the harsh winds. Families lived on different floors, with animals often kept on the lower levels and living quarters above. The rooftops provided views across the desert, and they served as gathering spaces in the cool of the evening. The towers of Shibam also acted as protection. In times of attack, residents could retreat behind the city walls and climb higher into their homes, using narrow staircases that were easy to defend. The height of the buildings created a sense of safety, as if the desert itself could be held at bay by the walls of clay. This vertical defense shows how architecture is not only about comfort or style, but also about survival. The people of Shibam turned the idea of a city into something that looked more like a fortress rising into the sky. The design was not unique to Yemen. Across history, societies imagined cities that reached upward, often linking these visions to power or divine favor. Ancient writers described the Hanging Gardens of Babylon as a wonder of the world. Though historians debate whether the gardens truly existed, the image of terraced greenery rising above the plains of Mesopotamia captured the imagination. These stories reveal an early fascination with building skyward, creating worlds that lifted humans above the ground and closer to the heavens. The idea of the vertical city has always carried both practical and symbolic meaning. At the same time, early attempts at vertical living faced clear limits. Mudbrick is strong when dry, but weak when wet. Heavy rains could erode the walls, and without constant repair, the towers would crumble. Even today, the people of Shibam must maintain their homes with fresh layers of clay after each rainy season. If they stop, the city begins to collapse. This constant maintenance shows the fragility of vertical ambition when the materials are vulnerable. Unlike stone or steel, clay demands a relationship of care between people and their environment. The city exists not as a fixed monument, but as a living structure that needs attention year after year. Imagine a family in Shibam during the rainy season. Water pours down the narrow streets, turning dust into thick mud. The lower walls of their home begin to soften, and cracks appear near the doorway. The family mixes new clay, hauls it up, and patches the weak spots before the damage spreads. They know that if they neglect this work, the weight of the floors above could bring the walls down. This cycle of erosion and repair defines life in the city. It's a reminder that vertical living, while impressive, comes with constant strain. Other societies wrestled with the same challenge in different ways. In the mountains of Peru, the Inca built terraces into steep slopes, turning vertical land into farmland. In medieval Europe, towns crowded into narrow spaces surrounded by walls, and church spires pierced the sky to mark religious and civic ambition. Each of these examples shows how verticality answered human needs for defense, land, or meaning. Yet they also reveal how fragile those answers were. High walls and towers demanded upkeep. When societies weakened or resources ran short, the structures decayed. Shibam remains a striking case because it shows both the promise and the cost of vertical building. It solved a real problem by conserving land and creating defense. It offered a model of density that modern architects might admire. But it also showed that height alone is not enough. Without durable materials and long-term planning, vertical cities become precarious. The towers of Shibam lean and crumble if they are not cared for, and they remind us that human ambition to reach the sky always comes with limits set by the earth. In the late 19th century, Chicago became the stage for a transformation that changed how cities would look forever. After the Great Fire of 1871 destroyed large parts of the city, architects and engineers faced the challenge of rebuilding fast and strong. Instead of repeating the old patterns of brick and stone, they turned to steel. A steel skeleton allowed buildings to rise much higher than load-bearing masonry walls ever could. The frame carried the weight, so walls could be thinner and pierced with large windows. This innovation marked the birth of the modern skyscraper. Alongside steel, another invention made these tall buildings practical. The elevator, first seen in safer form through Elisha Otis's safety brake system, gave people the ability to travel vertically without climbing endless flights of stairs. A 15-story tower without an elevator would have been useless, but with a simple push of a button, tenants could reach the top in comfort. The combination of steel frames and elevators was revolutionary. Suddenly, the sky was no longer a ceiling, it became a frontier. Chicago embraced the race upward with confidence. Architects like William LeBaron Jenney, who designed the home insurance building in 1885, showed that steel frame construction was not only possible, but reliable. Soon, the city filled with experimental towers, each one taller and bolder than the last. These early buildings were not yet the glass and steel icons we know today, but they established the principle that cities could grow vertically. In a city where land was scarce and population was rising, building upward made economic sense. Owners could fit more rentable floor space on the same plot of land, and tenants gained prestige from occupying offices high above the streets. Yet the rise of the skyscraper also stirred unease. The very sight of a building stretching far above its neighbors raised questions about safety, sunlight, and livability. Smoke from coal-fired boilers and factories already filled the urban air. Tall buildings trapped this pollution in narrow canyons, where wind could not clear it away. Streets, once bathed in natural light, sank into shadow as rows of towers blocked the sun. Shopkeepers complained their goods sat in darkness. Residents said their homes felt like caves. The skyscraper inspired awe, but also alarm. By the 1920s and 1930s, the scale of ambition reached new heights in New York. The Empire State Building rose to 102 stories, while the Chrysler Building stood as a gleaming symbol of Art Deco pride. These towers represented power, wealth, and a belief that technology could conquer space itself. For visitors, looking up at the spire of the Empire State Building was a moment of wonder. At the same time, for those who lived in the shadows of these giants, the experience was less inspiring. The towers consumed light and air, replacing them with steel, glass, and shadows. Cities began to push back. Boston and Washington, D.C. imposed strict height limits to preserve their character and prevent towers from overwhelming their streets. In New York, the zoning resolution of 1916 required setbacks, meaning tall buildings had to narrow as they rose. This law produced the distinctive wedding cake shape of many New York towers, designed to let light and air reach the streets below. These regulations show that even at the dawn of the skyscraper age, people recognized that unchecked vertical growth came at a cost. The tension between ambition and caution was clear. On one side stood the promise of the skyscraper, more space, modern design, and symbols of progress. On the other stood the fears of a city swallowed by its own towers, where streets grew dark, air grew foul, and the human scale disappeared. Chicago's steel revolution had unleashed a new kind of city, and every other city had to decide how much of the sky it was willing to give up. In the early years of the 21st century, San Francisco began to change in ways that were visible to anyone walking through the South of Market District. For decades, Soma had been a patchwork of warehouses, light industry, and low-rise housing. It was not considered a glamorous neighborhood, but it carried a working character that kept it rooted in the daily life of the city. By the 2000s, however, new forces had entered the scene. The tech industry was rising with unprecedented speed, and the demand for office space and housing grew just as fast. Land in the city was scarce, so developers looked upward. Between 2000 and 2018, more than 15 new towers taller than 30 stories appeared, and San Francisco began to resemble the silhouette of Manhattan. The word Manhattanization became the shorthand for this shift. The term was not neutral. Some used it with excitement, suggesting that San Francisco was joining the ranks of global cities defined by their vertical skylines. Others used it with worry or even disdain, seeing the glass towers as symbols of an imbalance that hurt the city more than it helped. For those living in Soma, the change was not only visual but personal. Rents climbed at a pace few could afford. Longtime residents found themselves pushed out as developers replaced older buildings with new luxury high-rises. The very character of the neighborhood shifted. Where small businesses, artists, and industrial workers had once formed a mixed community, sleek towers now housed tech workers with high salaries. Walking through Soma during those years revealed a city at odds with itself. On one street, you could see a steel crane raising a tower that promised high-end condos. Around the corner, you might find a homeless encampment tucked against the wall of a building. The contrast between extreme wealth and visible poverty was striking. It showed how vertical expansion did not simply solve the problem of housing shortage. Instead, it often made the divide between those who could pay and those who could not even sharper. The affordability crisis became a central part of the conversation. While towers added thousands of new units, most of them targeted upper-income buyers or renters. The cost of land and construction made it difficult to build affordable housing in these high-rises, and zoning rules often failed to force developers to include enough lower-cost units. As demand from tech workers kept prices rising, middle and low-income residents felt the squeeze. Teachers, service workers, and artists, the very people who gave San Francisco its cultural energy, struggled to stay in the city. Critics argued that this was the downside of Manhattanization. Unlike New York, which had long grown around a culture of high density and mass transit, San Francisco was a smaller city with a tradition of neighborhoods built on a more human scale. The high-rises seemed to ignore that scale, casting shadows over older Victorian homes and narrow streets. Residents felt that the city was losing not only affordability, but also its identity. The sense of place that came from diverse, low-rise neighborhoods gave way to a skyline that could have belonged to any global financial hub. At the same time, supporters of vertical growth made their case. They pointed to the fact that San Francisco had strict limits on sprawl, with the bay on one side and protected greenbelts on the other. If the city was to house a growing population, it had to grow upward. They argued that resisting towers would only drive prices higher by limiting supply. In their view, Manhattanization was not a threat, but a necessary adaptation to economic reality. This debate grew sharper when compared with New York. Manhattan had embraced density for more than a century, and while it also faced affordability crises, the scale of its housing stock and transit system made high density more workable. San Francisco, by contrast, lacked both the infrastructure and the political consensus to manage its own vertical surge. New York's density created certain efficiencies: subways, mixed-use neighborhoods, and a long tradition of renters living side by side in towers. San Francisco, however, imported the towers without importing the systems that made them sustainable in New York. For example, A worker in Manhattan could live in a high-rise, take the subway, and shop at stores within walking distance. A similar tower in Soma often assumed its residents owned cars or relied on ride-hailing services. This increased congestion and pollution. The city's transit system lagged behind the pace of construction, leaving residents with crowded buses and trains. The very density meant to create efficiency instead produced stress on infrastructure. The affordability spiral also played out differently. In New York, even though many neighborhoods were expensive, the scale of rental housing meant that some options, however limited, remained for lower-income residents. San Francisco's smaller size and more limited supply left fewer options. Manhattanization in San Francisco was less about welcoming all classes into a dense city and more about building towers that served a narrow slice of the population. The human scale loss was not only about buildings, but also about community. In older San Francisco neighborhoods, people could walk down streets lined with small shops, cafes, and parks. Towers replaced some of these with ground floors designed for chain stores or empty lobbies. Public space shrank, and private space grew taller. The shift left many residents feeling that the city no longer belonged to them. It had become a playground for investors and tech elites, rather than a shared home. Still, the skyline rose. From 2000 to 2018, cranes filled the air above Soma, reshaping the city's profile. The sales brochures for these towers promised views of the bay, luxury gyms, and rooftop pools. The contrast with the street life below was sharp, where tent encampments spread and service workers commuted long distances from outside the city because they could not afford to live near their jobs. This divide showed how vertical ambition, without careful planning, could deepen social strain. The story of Manhattanization in San Francisco illustrates the tension between growth and equity. The city tried to solve one problem, limited land and growing demand, by reaching upward. In doing so, it created new challenges around affordability, displacement, and human scale. The skyline may have begun to look like Manhattan's, but the social fabric frayed in ways that revealed the cost of unchecked vertical expansion. For many residents, the towers symbolized not progress, but loss. The loss of affordability, of character, and of a city that once felt like a shared home rather than a market for luxury units in the sky. Asia's cities have grown at a pace that has no parallel in history. Each day, around 100,000 people leave rural areas and move into urban centers across the continent. This migration has not only created new skylines, but has also reshaped land use. With every day that passes, more than 1,000 hectares of farmland vanish under concrete, steel, and asphalt. The cost is not only in the loss of crops, but in the heat and stress that these new megacities generate. Vertical ambition has become the face of Asia's rapid urbanization, but the price is carried by land, climate, and human life. In India, the rise of Mumbai, Delhi, and Bengaluru shows how urbanization has reached extremes. Mumbai, with its cluster of towers along the Arabian Sea, is home to both billionaires living in private skyscrapers and millions of residents in sprawling slums. The contrast defines the city. On one side, there are glass facades and rooftop helipads. On the other, corrugated metal roofs and open drains dominate the horizon. As more people crowd into the city each day, these inequalities become sharper. Families arrive from villages with hopes of steady wages, yet often end up in settlements with little security. The skyline shines for some, while the ground remains harsh for many. Delhi tells another part of the story. The capital city absorbs migrants not only from its own state, but from across northern India. Its expansion consumes farmland and natural areas at a relentless pace. The city has grown in rings, each ring pushing further into what once were fields and orchards. As the concrete spreads, so does the heat. The urban heat island effect has turned Delhi into a furnace during summer, with nighttime temperatures that refuse to cool. Air conditioners hum through the night, but they provide relief only for those who can afford them. Power demand strains the grid, while poorer neighborhoods face frequent outages. The city has climbed upward, but the infrastructure below has cracked under the weight. Bengaluru presents a different picture, but shares the same pressures. Once known as the Garden City of India, it built its reputation on cool climate and tree-lined avenues. In recent decades, however, it has been overtaken by towers for information technology companies and their workers. Its lakes, once central to the city's water system, have shrunk or filled with sewage. Green cover has declined, and the city now traps heat instead of releasing it. The offices and apartments that climb upward add to the strain, while the city's roads and sewers lag behind. The pace of construction outstrips the capacity to provide basic services. What was once a city, celebrated for its balance with nature, now finds itself short on water and long on glass towers. Mumbai shows the scale of the ecological cost most clearly. Studies comparing cooling expenses have found that electricity bills for air conditioning in Mumbai double those in New York, even though New York sometimes faces hotter summers. The reason lies in how the city is built. Towers made of glass and concrete store heat during the day and release it slowly at night. This makes interiors warm and forces residents to run air conditioners longer. Wealthier families may pay those bills without concern, but for middle-class households, cooling costs carve deep into monthly budgets. For the poor, air conditioning is out of reach. They endure nights in stifling heat, where sleep is broken and health suffers. The city's shape itself has made it harder to live in. Inequality stands at the center of Asia's vertical surge. Luxury towers advertise infinity pools, fitness centers, and private cinemas high above the city streets. Below them, sprawling informal settlements hold millions who live without reliable water or sanitation. In Mumbai, Dharavi remains one of the world's largest slums, packed with workshops, houses, and alleys, all within walking distance of high-end skyscrapers. The skyline above and the ground below might as well belong to two different cities. The wealthy dild upward, while the poor spread sideways, and the gap between the two grows wider with each year. The pressures extend beyond housing. Food security is affected as farmland shrinks under new construction. Each day that 1,000 hectares of fields disappear, supply chains stretch further. Vegetables and grains that once came from nearby must travel longer distances, raising prices and carbon emissions. For the migrants who form the labor base of these cities, rising food costs add to the struggle. Families who moved for better wages often find their income consumed by rent, electricity, and groceries, leaving little left for savings or education. The dream of a better life in the city often becomes a cycle of survival. Infrastructure struggles to keep pace with this growth. Sewage systems overflow, power grids strain, and water shortages spread. In Delhi, groundwater levels drop each year, forcing residents to drill deeper or buy water from private tankers. In Bengaluru, water has become so scarce that many apartments rely on deliveries. These problems multiply as populations grow by hundreds of thousands each year. Vertical expansion has not been matched by horizontal planning in transit, utilities, or public services. Cities grow taller, but not stronger. The human cost is visible in the daily lives of those at the lower end of the income scale. A construction worker may spend the day building a tower that he will never enter except to labor. At night, he may return to a one-room dwelling in a slum with no reliable electricity or clean water. Meanwhile, the apartments he built may stand half empty, held by investors who treat them as assets rather than homes. The city grows taller, but not more just. The workers who build it remain excluded from its benefits. Asia's megacities have become symbols of ambition, wealth, and modernity, but they also highlight the steep price of unchecked growth. The daily arrival of 100,000 new migrants and the disappearance of farmland at the rate of 1,000 hectares a day point to a cycle that is difficult to sustain. Cities that promise opportunity risk becoming unlivable for many who make them function. The explosion of vertical ambition has eaten into the sky, but it has also eaten into the land, the climate, and the shared fabric of life that ties city to countryside. Dense cities change their own climate. When thousands of buildings rise close together, the surfaces of glass, asphalt, and concrete trap the sun's energy during the day and release it slowly at night. This process is known as the urban heat island effect. Measurements across the world have shown that the temperature difference between city centers and nearby rural areas can range from 1 to 6 degrees Celsius. That gap may sound small, but it shapes how millions live. Even a 2-degree increase can turn a tolerable summer night into one where sleep is broken, where electricity demand spikes, and where health risks climb for the elderly and those with heart or lung problems. The rise in temperature is not only about discomfort. Higher heat in cities means more energy consumption for cooling. Air conditioners run longer, drawing more power from already strained grids. This creates a cycle. Machines pump out hot exhaust into the air, while also pulling electricity from plants that often burn fossil fuels. The result is higher emissions and worse air quality. Poorer neighborhoods where residents may not have air conditioning face the direct weight of this cycle without relief. For them, the difference between city and countryside is not an abstract number, but a daily threat. Urban form plays a role in how heat builds. Tall buildings aligned along narrow streets create what planners call urban canyons. These canyons trap pollutants and block the flow of wind that could otherwise cool the streets. They also reduce access to daylight, making lower floors dim and reliant on artificial lighting during the day. The same structures that symbolize ambition can, in effect, choke the life of a city by cutting off its air and light. The problem is not height alone, but the density and arrangement of towers without enough space for circulation. Cities have long wrestled with these side effects. In New York, early 20th century planners responded to both sunlight loss and the canyon effect with the 1916 zoning resolution. This rule required tall buildings to include setbacks, meaning they had to step back at higher levels rather than rise as sheer walls. The law was not only an aesthetic choice, but a direct attempt to preserve access to sunlight on streets below. Walking down a New York avenue today, one can still see the tiered effect on older skyscrapers, a physical trace of an era when light itself had to be written into law. London, with its windy climate, faced a different challenge. Glass towers rising in the late 20th and early 21st centuries created wind tunnels at ground level. The smooth surfaces accelerated breezes into gales that knocked over pedestrians and made walking unpleasant. In response, regulations were introduced to test wind effects during the planning stage of tall buildings. Developers had to model how their projects would change airflow and design features to deflect or soften the gusts. Canopies, screens, and curved facades became tools not only of style but of safety. The city recognized that towers cannot stand without regard for those who move at their base. Pollution adds another layer. When heat builds and wind is blocked, particulate matter and vehicle exhaust linger. Smog becomes more likely on hot days, and respiratory problems rise. In megacities with high car dependence, this effect compounds. Urban canyons lined with traffic and sealed by towers create pockets where air feels heavy and stale. The health burden is not shared evenly. Children, older adults, and workers who spend their days outdoors bear the brunt. The link between architecture, environment, and public health is written most clearly in these narrow corridors of heat and haze. Tokyo offers an example of how cities can confront these pressures directly. In the 1990s and 2000s, as summers became hotter and the effects of dense development grew, the city government invested in mitigation infrastructure. Green roofs were promoted across office blocks and residential towers, not for beauty alone, but to cool buildings and absorb stormwater. Pavements were redesigned with reflective materials to lower surface temperatures. Shade trees were planted along streets, and incentives encouraged private developers to include ventilation corridors in their projects. These steps showed that even in one of the most crowded cities on Earth, space could be carved out for air and light. The results in Tokyo have been measurable. Localized cooling has cut surface temperatures by several degrees in areas with concentrated green roofs and reflective pavements. Ventilation corridors have allowed breezes to flow more freely through parts of the city that would otherwise have baked in stagnant air. The measures have not erased the urban heat island, but they have softened its extremes. More importantly, they have set a model that other dense cities now study. By linking zoning, design, and ecology, Tokyo has shown that urban climate is not fixed, but can be shaped. The physics behind these efforts is straightforward. Light surfaces reflect, rather than absorb solar energy. Greenery provides shade and releases moisture, cooling the air through evaporation. Building setbacks open the sky to lower levels and allow wind to move. Yet putting these principles into practice in dense cities requires political will and financial investment. Developers may see green roofs or reflective materials as added costs. Residents may resist zoning that limits tower size. Planners must balance ambition with protection, ensuring that the drive to rise does not block the very elements that make a city habitable. The story of heat, wind, and light in cities is a reminder that ambition has consequences beyond the skyline. Every rise in average temperature, every blocked breeze, every lost patch of daylight filters down into daily life. It shapes how people work, how much they pay in energy bills, and how healthy they remain through the seasons. Towers may scrape the sky, but they also shape the air we breathe and the ground we walk. As cities continue to grow, the struggle is not only to reach higher, but to protect the basic elements that make life possible in the shadows of ambition. Cities grow by consuming land. The spread of towers and highways comes at the cost of fields, orchards, and wetlands that once produced food or filtered water. Each day across Asia alone, over 1,000 hectares of farmland vanish under concrete. This loss is not temporary. Once a rice paddy or a vegetable field is turned into parking or apartments, the soil hardens, water channels disappear, and returning the land to farming becomes close to impossible. The more cities stretch, the more they depend on distant supply chains for staples. Trucks must drive longer distances to bring vegetables, fruit, and grain into urban centers. The journey adds to prices, emissions, and vulnerability. A strike, flood, or drought hundreds of miles away can suddenly leave a supermarket shelf empty. In this sense, the vertical growth of cities is not only about buildings pressing into the sky, but also about the steady erasure of the land that once fed them. Urban planners and architects have looked for solutions that would allow food to be grown inside the city rather than outside of it. The idea of sky farms grew from this pressure. Instead of treating towers as only places for housing or offices, designers asked whether they could also function as stacked fields. Hydroponic systems make it possible to grow lettuce, herbs, and even tomatoes without soil, using nutrient-rich water circulated through trays. Rainwater can be collected on roofs and channeled downward through these systems. Waste from kitchens or biogas from sewage can supply the energy for pumps and lights. In theory, a tower could create its own food chain from rooftop to basement, turning the act of farming into a vertical process. Singapore has been a testing ground for this vision. With limited land and almost no traditional agriculture, the city-state has invested in rooftop farms and vertical gardens as a form of resilience. High above office blocks and residential buildings, rows of leafy greens grow under controlled light and water systems. Companies like Sky Greens rotate hydroponic troughs along tall frames, maximizing yield in small footprints. On public housing estates, rooftop gardens supply local vegetables directly to residents, cutting transport costs and reducing reliance on imports. These projects are modest compared to the demand of millions, but they point toward a shift. Instead of drawing everything from distant rural areas, part of the daily food supply can now be produced within sight of the consumer. Water presents its own challenge. As cities expand, natural watersheds are paved over. Rain that once soaked into soil now floods into drains, carrying pollution into rivers or stagnating in low areas. At the same time, demand for clean water climbs with each new tower. Pipes must reach higher floors, reservoirs must be tapped, and groundwater must be pumped deeper. Some cities are already struggling with depletion. In Jakarta, aquifers are so overdrawn that the land itself is sinking. Wells that once reached water now hit air, and the ground subsides as it collapses into the empty space. The city has turned to rainwater harvesting on new buildings as one response. Capturing rainfall on roofs and channeling it into storage tanks allows a partial supply to be kept on site. Combined with recycling of wastewater, these methods offer ways to stretch limited resources. Jakarta has also been the site of one of the most ambitious visions of vertical resilience. The proposed Peruri 88 Tower, conceived as a stack of homes, shops, offices, and public spaces, it included gardens, parks, and semi-public decks layered throughout the building. The idea was that a single vertical block could function like a city in miniature, with food grown in sky gardens, rain captured on terraces, and waste reused to feed the cycle. Although the project has faced delays, its concept remains influential. It asks not only how high a city can go, but how self-sufficient it can become once it leaves the ground. The image of children playing in a park suspended halfway up a tower, while vegetables grow in plots beside them, captures both the promise and the strangeness of this approach. The challenge is scale. A single vertical farm may feed a few hundred households. A rooftop garden may provide herbs and greens for a block of flats. But a city of millions consumes food and water on a scale that far exceeds what these projects can provide. The question becomes, how many towers, how many rooftops, and how many vertical farms are needed before the system makes a real dent in supply? Each step helps, yet the bulk of rice, wheat, maize, and meat still comes from fields and pastures far outside city limits. What the experiments prove is not that towers can replace farms, but that they can supplement them, soften shortages, and build buffers against shocks. The integration of waste into this cycle shows how cities might close some of their loops. Kitchen scraps, sewage, and organic waste that once filled landfills can be processed into compost or biogas. In a vertical farm, this waste becomes part of the nutrient solution for crops. Lights powered by methane digesters can illuminate hydroponic trays. Rain collected on roofs can wash produce before reaching storage. In this way, waste ceases to be a burden and becomes a resource. The cycle reduces dependence on outside fertilizers, lowers landfill volumes, and cuts the carbon footprint of transport. Examples already exist at smaller scales. In Singapore, rooftop farms in shopping centers supply fresh vegetables directly to restaurants below. Diners eat salads grown on the same building where they shop. In Tokyo, companies operate vertical gardens within office towers, using them both for staff cafeterias and as a form of education. Employees can see lettuce and herbs growing beside their desks. These examples blur the line between work, food, and architecture. They suggest that the future city may not separate farmland from urban land, but weave them together in unusual ways. The strain on food and water systems grows each year as urbanization continues. More migrants arrive, more towers rise, and more farmland disappears. The solutions may not fully replace what is lost, but they mark a shift in thinking. A city that eats the sky cannot afford to ignore the ground and the resources it consumes. Sky farms, rainwater harvesting, and stacked parks point toward an urban form that attempts to carry its own weight. Whether such systems can scale fast enough remains uncertain, but the need for them becomes clearer as each hectare of farmland turns into concrete. Life in towers is not only about architecture or engineering, it's also about how people adapt to a world stacked on top of itself. In cities where vertical living is the norm, everyday routines shift. Children play in hallways or on rooftops instead of in yards. Neighbors may live just a few feet away, yet contact is shaped by elevator rides and shared corridors. The distance between the ground and the upper floors is not only physical, but also social. It changes how communities form and how people understand their surroundings. Hong Kong shows how vertical living can be made resilient when designed with public needs in mind. More than half the population has lived in public housing at some point. These towers are not just shelters, but part of a broader system that tries to provide stability in a crowded city. Shared spaces, schools, clinics, and transport links are built into housing estates. Residents may live on the 35th floor, but they still feel connected to the city because the ground-level planning supports them. The government has kept rents affordable in many estates, and this has given generations of working families the ability to stay in the city. The scale is massive, but the intent has been to keep towers livable, not just profitable. Dubai presents a striking contrast. Its skyline is filled with glass towers, each one projecting wealth and ambition. Yet the people who build and maintain these towers, many of them migrant workers, often live far from the luxury they construct. Housing for workers is segregated, placed on the city's margins in dormitories with few rights or protections. They ride buses to job sites, labor in the heat, and return to cramped quarters outside the city's celebrated core. The towers shine as symbols of prosperity, but the people who make them possible are excluded from their benefits. Vertical living here reinforces inequality instead of easing it. The distance between floors becomes a metaphor for the distance between classes. Writers have captured this divide through fiction. J.G. Ballard's novel High Rise imagines a luxury tower where residents retreat into isolation, turning the building into a world of conflict and alienation. The novel exaggerates, but its core idea remains sharp. A tower can concentrate wealth and status, but it can also strip away community. Neighbors who share walls may live as strangers. A building that was meant to symbolize progress can instead produce detachment and even hostility. Fiction, in this case, gives language to the unease many feel when living in structures that place thousands of people in close quarters without strong social ties. Research into the psychological effects of high-rise living has added evidence to these concerns. Studies on children raised in towers suggest that access to outdoor play and community contact is reduced. When play is confined to balconies or stairwells, physical activity decreases and feelings of isolation rise. Families may find it harder to build networks with neighbors, especially when each floor feels sealed off. Mental health researchers note higher levels of stress and depression in residents of poorly designed towers, especially when noise, crowding, and lack of green space combine. A child growing up on the 40th floor without safe outdoor space may face challenges that a suburban child with a yard and park nearby does not. At the same time, design can make a difference. When towers include open courtyards, gardens, and communal rooms, residents report stronger social ties and better quality of life. In Singapore, for example, many high-rise estates feature playgrounds and hawker centers built directly into housing blocks. These become meeting points that allow neighbors to form bonds beyond their individual apartments. The tower does not erase community if planners make space for it. The challenge lies in seeing towers not only as machines for housing, but as homes for people with social and emotional needs. Examples from different cultures highlight the range of outcomes. In Hong Kong, long waiting lists for public housing show that people value the stability these towers offer, even with limited space. In contrast, in parts of London during the 20th century, tower blocks were associated with neglect and social breakdown, largely because they were poorly maintained and lacked supportive infrastructure. The same basic form, concrete stacked high, produced opposite experiences depending on how it was integrated into daily life. This shows that vertical living is not inherently alienating. It depends on context, care, and community. Another element shaping life between floors is the sense of status tied to height. In many markets, upper floors command higher rents or prices. The view, the distance from noise, and the prestige of being above others become selling points. Yet this reinforces a hierarchy within the building itself. Those who can afford penthouses enjoy sunlight and quiet, while those on lower levels face shadows and traffic. In this sense, the building encodes inequality into its very structure. A tower becomes not only a place to live, but a vertical map of privilege. Despite these challenges, many residents adapt. Families build routines that make towers workable. Children find playmates in hallways. Elderly residents gather in lobbies to talk. Migrants send money home, seeing their cramped apartments as stepping stones to better futures. People humanize the concrete through daily acts of resilience. This adaptation shows that while towers change social patterns, they do not erase them entirely. Humans adjust, though not always without cost. The city that eats the sky does more than reshape land and air. It reshapes the inner life of its inhabitants. Vertical living alters how people relate to neighbors, how children grow, and how communities endure. Some towers succeed in becoming places of connection, while others stand as symbols of exclusion. The life between floors is as important as the steel and glass that holds the structure together, because without it, the tower risks becoming only a shell. Cities learned early that height needs rules. After Chicago rebuilt from the 1871 fire, towers rose fast and public worry rose with them. In 1893, the city set a cap on building height to keep streets from falling into shadow and to calm fears about safety. The limit began at around 130 feet and later increased, but the message was clear: growth would not be a free climb. As steel frames and elevators spread, Chicago kept adjusting its code, moving from simple caps to controls on bulk and setbacks. The city wanted the benefits of vertical space without losing light, air, and order on the ground. That balance shaped the skyline as much as money or style did. Boston took a similar path, but with a New England strictness. In the 1890s, the city passed laws that held most buildings to modest heights, with tighter limits in residential districts and near civic landmarks. The aim was sunlight, fire safety, and a streetscape that felt human. You can still read those choices in the scale of many Boston blocks. The buildings stand shoulder to shoulder, but they stop before they blot out the sky. Rules made the skyline polite. In Washington, D.C., the rules became even firmer. The Height of Buildings Act tied the top of a building to the width of the street it faced. In practice, that kept most of the city between 6 and 12 stories. The Capitol gained a low, bright horizon where the Capitol Dome and the Washington Monument remain the tallest notes. Critics say the cap limits housing and office supply. Supporters point to the light, the views, and the way the city breathes. New York took another route. It let towers rise, then wrote a new grammar to manage them. The 1916 zoning resolution did not cap a building at a single height. Instead, it asked a building to step back as it climbed so light and air could spill onto the street. That rule created the wedding cake form that defines early skyscrapers. Later codes shifted to floor area ratios and tower on podium forms. But the core idea stayed: if you take from the sky, give some back to the street. A century later, New York added a different kind of rule with the Climate Mobilization Act. Rather than shape alone, it targets the carbon that large buildings emit. Local Law 97 sets limits on greenhouse gas emissions per square foot and pushes owners to retrofit with better insulation, efficient HVAC, and cleaner power. Now a tower must meet not only a zoning envelope, but also a carbon budget. The city moved from sunlight rights to climate rights. London's lesson came on the wind. As glass towers multiplied in the city and Canary Wharf, people felt sudden gusts at ground level. Smooth facades and tight clusters funneled breezes into fast streams that made walking risky and outdoor seating useless. Regulators responded with wind microclimate guidelines. Developers now test designs in wind tunnels or with fluid simulations, then adjust podiums, canopies, screens, and corners to calm the flow. Comfort and safety became measurable design targets. A beautiful tower that knocks people off their feet does not pass. London also links its tall buildings policy to views of protected landmarks, so height is filtered through wind, light, and heritage at once. Paris has long resisted very tall towers. After the Montparnasse Tower drew broad criticism in the 1970s, the city kept a low cap across most districts and allowed higher forms only in select zones at the edge. The result is a city where the horizon remains flat and stone-colored, and where density comes more from continuous mid-rise blocks than from spikes. From time to time, the city tests a taller proposal, like Tour Triangle at the Porte de Versailles, but each case faces debate about shadows, wind, and the feel of the street. Paris treats height as an exception rather than a norm. That stance preserves character, but it also keeps pressure on housing supply and prices unless the city adds floor area in other ways. These rules show two views of vertical growth. In one view, height is hunger. The market wants more space and more status, and the skyline becomes a contest of peaks. In the other view, height is a privilege that the city grants only when the public gets something back. That something can be sunlight on the sidewalk, a pocket park, a safer wind field, lower carbon, or a slice of affordable housing. When rules are clear and enforced, developers design within them and sometimes discover better forms. When rules are weak or easy to bend, Short-term wins can leave long-term harm. Dark streets, wind tunnels, overloaded grids, and a city that costs more to cool and to breathe in. Think of two corners of the same downtown block. On one corner, a sheer glass wall rises from the lot line, throwing a long shadow and speeding the wind at rush hour. On the other corner, a tower steps back above a porous podium that holds shops and a public passage. Trees line the setback plaza, and a screen softens the gusts. Both corners produce rentable area. Only one makes the street better. Codes tilt the odds toward the second case, but they need teeth and staff who can say no. A drawing that looks fine in elevation can fail in section and on a hot July afternoon. Modern frameworks push beyond shape. New York's carbon caps treat a leaky facade or a dirty boiler as civic problems. Owners face fines if they do not cut emissions, so projects add heat pumps, better glazing, smart controls, and sometimes on-site solar. The grid then sees lower peak loads on the hottest days. London's wind rules prevent the worst microclimates before they are built. Paris's caps protect light and heritage, but force creativity in adding homes, whether by attic conversions, deeper courtyards, or mid-rise infill along transit. The debate now is simple to state and hard to settle. Grow taller or grow smarter. Taller can deliver many homes near transit and jobs, cut commutes, and save land at the edge. But taller without rules can harm street life, raise energy use, and deepen inequality. Smarter means linking height to transit, daylight, wind comfort, green space, and carbon, then auditing results after people move in. It means asking a tower to prove it owns its place in the sky. A city can choose height as a tool rather than a reflex. The record from Chicago to Paris suggests that when rules lead, skylines still rise, and the streets below remain places where people want to live. A city that builds higher often carries guilt in its concrete. The towers block light, channel wind, and replace ground soil with glass and steel. Yet some places try to return life to the sky rather than take it away. Milan's Bosco Verticale was one of the first to show this was possible. Two towers, modest in height compared to global icons, were planted with over 900 trees and thousands of shrubs. Balconies became soil beds, and irrigation ran through the structure. Seen from a distance, the buildings look more like cliffs of vegetation than real estate. For the residents, the greenery filters dust, cools the interiors, and changes with the seasons. For the city, it proves that biodiversity does not have to vanish when density grows. Birds nest in the branches, bees forage, and urban wildlife find shelter where there would have been only blank walls. The Bosco became both a home and a garden, and it reframed the idea of luxury. Space in the towers sells at a premium, not because of glass or marble, but because of trees. Singapore extended this experiment in a different form with Park Royal on Pickering. This hotel did not hide its gardens on the roof. Instead, it draped them across entire floors, carved out sky terraces, and let vines spill down its edges. A traveler checking into the hotel meets a series of planted decks that blur the line between lobby, park, and facade. Singapore's climate makes plants grow fast and thick, but the point is not only display. The vegetation shades the rooms, reduces cooling loads, and collects rain. The city has made green infrastructure a core part of its urban plan, with incentives for developers to replace ground greenery with equal or greater area higher up. Park Royal shows what that policy looks like in practice. Guests walk under canopies of palms while staying in the densest downtown, and the building demonstrates that vertical ambition can also mean vertical gardens. The image spreads far beyond Singapore, shaping how architects in other cities think about towers and nature. Chicago, where the skyscraper was born, has seen a return of green ideas at high altitude. One proposal, known as Gateway, sketches a high-rise that weaves vertical farms into its frame. Instead of a sealed office tower, the design calls for layers of hydroponic crops, recycling water and nutrients through the system. The food grown could serve the community within and reduce transport costs that move produce hundreds of miles before reaching a store. Chicago already has a history of rooftop farming, with greenhouses producing greens and herbs in former factories. The idea of Gateway is to scale that logic into the core of the vertical city. If successful, such a model could shift towers from pure consumers of energy and goods to partial producers. A tenant might buy lettuce grown 5 floors above rather than shipped from California. It is a vision that links vertical ambition with food security and resilience, and while it remains more plan than practice, it signals where green redemption might head. Mumbai faces a sharper test. The city grows denser by the year, with land scarce and air heavy with heat. In such a place, the idea of Yatra Tower is bold. Planned with sky bridges and elevated green spaces, the tower imagines not just balconies with potted plants, but genuine landscapes suspended in the air. Bridges would connect different blocks of the tower, creating mid-air parks where residents could meet, walk, or rest. These spaces would ease the isolation that often comes with high-rise living, where neighbors pass in lifts but rarely gather. By stacking gardens and linking them with bridges, Yatra proposes a new kind of street life far above the ground. In a city where horizontal open space is nearly gone, the tower suggests that community parks can be vertical as well as horizontal. If it moves beyond paper, it could mark a shift from Mumbai's skyline and its social fabric. These cases show that vertical growth does not have to mean bare facades and sealed systems. Trees, farms, and parks can rise with the steel. The gains are not only aesthetic. Shade reduces energy demand in hot climates. Plants trap dust and lower air pollution near facades. Rainwater can be stored and reused for irrigation, easing strain on storm drains. The soil and greenery support insects and birds that maintain urban ecosystems. Most of all, these interventions remind residents that even in a tower, life is not cut off from nature. A balcony forest in Milan, a hanging terrace in Singapore, a hydroponic floor in Chicago, or a bridge garden in Mumbai all show that the city can eat the sky and still leave room for green life. The balance is fragile, but the examples prove it is not impossible. The phrase, "the city that ate the sky," captures both awe and unease. In Mumbai, San Francisco, and Dubai, the skyline became a measure of power and ambition. Each city rose upward for its own reasons, yet all shared a hunger that seemed to consume the air above. Mumbai pushed higher because land was scarce and the population soared. The city became a forest of towers, with luxury apartments overlooking sprawling slums. The divide was not only social, but physical. Wealthy residents looked down from glass walls while millions struggled in crowded lanes below. The city's towers promised efficiency and prestige, but the cost was unevenly spread, from suffocating heat trapped in concrete canyons to rising energy bills. In this way, Mumbai became a devourer, swallowing the sky without giving back. San Francisco's transformation carried a different story. The boom of the early 2000s and the flood of tech wealth drove construction in Soma and downtown. High-rises replaced warehouses, casting long shadows over streets once filled with artists and small businesses. The city gained towers but lost balance. Housing prices surged, displacement spread, and the once eclectic human scale of neighborhoods gave way to glass walls and office parks. The term Manhattanization emerged to capture both pride and alarm. It suggested that the city was not just growing, but being consumed by vertical ambition, losing sunlight and affordability in the process. Here again, the hunger for the sky left scars on the ground. Dubai perhaps offers the clearest image of consumption. In a desert where water and energy are scarce, towers soared in every direction. The Burj Khalifa rose as a monument not to need, but to spectacle. Cooling systems run day and night. Desalination plants strained to provide water, and migrant laborers sustain the machine while often excluded from its rewards. The city projects power through its skyline, but the price is borne in resources and human cost. The towers dazzle, but they also devour. In each of these cities, unchecked ambition shaped skylines that ate the sky with little thought for what they gave back. Against this hunger stand the rebels. From the early days of zoning laws in New York to height restrictions in Boston and Washington, D.C., societies have recognized that there must be limits. New York's 1916 setback law was one of the first to insist that sunlight must reach the streets, even if towers wanted to block it. Washington capped building height to keep the dome of the Capitol visible, tying the city's image to democratic ideals rather than corporate ambition. Boston resisted towers that might overwhelm its historic fabric. These measures did not end vertical growth, but they tamed it. They slowed the pace and forced developers to think not only of profit, but of the street, the air, and the light. In more recent years, ecological regulations have joined the fight. London introduced rules against wind tunnels. Paris capped building heights to protect its skyline, and New York's Climate Mobilization Act placed emissions limits on tall buildings. Each of these measures reflects an attempt to keep cities from eating more than they can digest. Then there are the redeemers. If devourers take and rebels restrict, redeemers try to transform the very act of building tall. Milan's Bosco Verticale planted trees into the sky, turning balconies into miniature forests. Singapore's Park Royal wove gardens into the facade of a hotel, proving that density and greenery can coexist. In Chicago, designs for vertical farms suggest that towers could feed rather than just house their residents. In Mumbai, proposals for sky bridges with gardens imagine that towers could create new communities rather than isolate individuals. These projects are not without challenges. They require careful maintenance, engineering, and investment. Yet they offer a path forward where ambition is not suppressed but redirected. They show that a city can rise without devouring everything in its way. The metaphor of the city that ate the sky works because it captures this tension. Cities will always reach higher. The pressure of population, the economics of land, and the pride of nations make vertical ambition inevitable. To build upward is to declare survival and status, but ambition without limits turns destructive. It consumes light, air, soil, and human dignity. It leaves people cut off from nature and each other. It leaves heat islands, shadows, and inequality in its wake. The question is not whether cities will continue to grow tall. The question is how they will choose to do so. The image of a devourer city is easy to picture. Towers swallowing the sun, wind tunnels scouring the streets, slums pressed against luxury towers. The image of a rebel city is one where ordinances and regulations act like fences, keeping ambition in check. And the image of a redeemer city is one where greenery spills from terraces, where farms rise floor by floor, where sky bridges carry communities across the air. These images offer three ways of thinking about vertical life. Each city on Earth today leans toward one or another, often combining them in uneasy balance. The phrase also carries a warning. To eat the sky is to consume something shared, something that belongs to all. The sky is not private property. It is light, air, and climate. When a tower rises without thought, it claims more than just a view. It takes from everyone around it. But when a tower is shaped with care, it can return shade, greenery, and even food. The future of cities rests in this balance. The appetite for the sky will not vanish. The choice is whether the city will continue to devour or whether it will learn to give something back.